Hey guys, welcome to BP, the Bible Perspective. Liberal talk show host Bill Maher, is he pushing the conservative talking point narrative, the war on white culture? But judging by the latest episode on Real Time with Bill Maher, it seems so. I want to break that segment down and dissect it. But before I do, please like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comments section below. All comments are welcome. Now, I was surprised by Bill Maher because I always appreciated his approach to subject in a fair, logical way. And though as a Christian, I disagree with his atheism and his views on atheism and his views on Christianity, but that's okay. But this surprised me because in a recent episode of Real Time with Bill Maher, he featured Douglas Maher, and I'll get to him in a moment, as he spewed a lot of his white conservative ideology. And Bill not only allowed it, but in some cases co-signed to some of the ideology. And that surprised me. And I want to break down this segment he did and unpack it and show you where they are just wrong. And not only wrong, but of course, misrepresenting reality and truth. Douglas Maher is a conservative British commentary and author. He's been featured on PragerU, the likes of Candace Owens. His latest book, The War on the West, is what he was allowed by Bill to dominate this segment. And in this War on the West, he talks about, criticizes when you talk truth about American history. The other thing about it is that, what do they mean, the war on the West? Because this is a global expansion. Now, we see these kind of arguments coming out of Fox News and PragerU, where they try to rewrite history when it comes to white guilt. And that's important because it's not just history thereafter. In other words, they'll talk about slavery, but they're going to minimize it. They're going to downplay it. Worse, they're going to say things like how good white slave owners were. In other words, hey, they fed their slaves, right? They clothed their slaves, loved their slaves. And so Mary's approach is, why are you criticizing that? Why are we dwelling on that past? So I want to unpack this. And as I said, I'm most surprised at Bill Maher's response to this. But let's get into it.
So let's continue. I love this discussion we're having about civilization because your book talks about the West. I mean, you talk about a war on the West. Again, let's pause for a second for some of the younger viewers who want to watch a show like this. We're like, what do they mean by the West? You're not born knowing that. Let's just be basic here. What is it? What are we talking about when we say the West?
Now, before he defines that, let me tell you what he won't say. He is talking about the white Caucasian, the white European Caucasian. That's what he means by West. But I'm going to let him unfold this because it is quite amazing. Here we go.
Well, in some ways it's a geographical fact. In others, it's a civilizational one.
It's both.
Yeah,
right.
And broadly speaking, the West is a product of a very specific set of values and ideas. I'd say that the religious...
Europe, mostly through Europe.
Through Europe.
Starting in Greece and Rome, antiquity,
exactly.
And then a mood.
It's basically the fusion of the biblical tradition and Athens and Jerusalem, and then the ancient civilizations of Greece and Rome, and that gave us much of the ideas. It got refined through the fires of the Enlightenment.
Got to England, they came to America.
England,
that's the West.
You did your thing.
Right.
And
what it's not is Africa, Asia,
exactly.
Russia, That's the East.
You know what it is when you're not in it. You know if you're in Beijing, you're not in the West. It's an amazing place. Tokyo, it's an amazing place, but you're not in the West.
People who want to know what third world, if they heard that, that comes from the Cold War. The first world was us good guys in the West who had democracy and richer economies. The second world was the communists. And the third world was poor countries who were too poor to care about either one of those systems. That was the third world. We don't use that term anymore. Okay. Okay, so let's leave that. Why is there a war on it?
Well,
all right, so as you can see, they kind of break it down from the continent. And that's why I said what they mean is they're not talking about Africa. When they talk about the West, so first you have to say geographically because of America. However, it is more the type of person, meaning the European Caucasian in those nations. And so notice he said two things. One, he said they bring a set of values to the world. He mentions biblical values, and that's interesting. I'll get back to that in a moment. But when he says that these sets of values that they bring, he neglects to talk about other civilizations who have brought values. Like, for example, Egypt, Assyria. These were mighty nations. There's still wonders in Egypt as we speak, right? The pyramids, math, science, all of these things that came out of these African nations. China, same thing. There are values that came out of China. But when he talks about Rome and Greece, remember that is specifically Caucasian. But Rome was no different than some of the other nations. Like, for example, he's referring to the promiscuity, the debauchery that plagued Rome. How about the pagan gods? And even though Rome was a mighty empire, what about the pagan gods? So it's interesting that God says that Babylon was is the greatest nation or empire that has ever existed. Were they Caucasian? He is not referring to them. Okay? So again, when they are talking about these so-called values, he says biblical values. Well, the Bible, biblical value, reach the entire world. Africa, the very nation that he claims that modern civilization didn't have. In other words, think about it. You think about Africa, you always think about the dark continent of Africa. You know, that's where slavery was at. That's where they were swinging in these trees with bones in their noses, naked. That is the propaganda. While at the same time, what came out of Europe, thinking people, moral people. Really? Now, it's interesting that he mentions biblical values, being as though he is gay. So it's kind of interesting. I would love to see him on stage with an evangelical, because remember, one of their core beliefs today is anti-homosexuality. But I do digress. Let's continue.
What is the war? Why?
One of the things that's come to concern me recently is, I mean, this country, America, is, as you know very well, is about as divided as you can be without having a war.
Correct.
You agree on almost nothing. I mean, having different opinions is so last century. Now you've got different facts.
Right.
Yes. You know, and this goes all ways. You know, you have an election in 2016 and part of the country doesn't accept it. You have an election in 2020, part of the country doesn't accept it. That's not normal in a democracy.
No.
Mostly, if you win, you know you've won, and when you've lost, you know you've lost, and that's really good for you. Really good for you. So one of the things that started to concern
Really good
me
for
is,
the civilization.
yes.
Yes.
Because you've got to work out what you did wrong. You mucked up. The people didn't like you. Maybe you're not very likable.
Right. And let's also point out that in most countries in the world throughout history, that didn't happen.
Right.
Where one guy just went, you know what? I lost.
Yeah, most of history is people...
Good fight. Now you take over this place where we run the
most
country.
of history is people like hitting each other over the head and taking their stuff.
And lots of still are doing that.
And still doing that.
Yes.
So one of the things that has just increasingly worried me, and as a immigrant in this country, is the past really matters in these circumstances.
Okay, so I'm not for sure when he talks about the elections, who he's criticizing. Is he criticizing Trump for not accepting his loss? So I'm just not sure on that. Now, one of the things that they're trying to say, however, is the ideal that we brought democracy. And there's a lot that can be said, because that is a fierce fight over if there's really democracy. Is there really fair elections? Are there really true elections? So just to, I can say, now he's getting ready to get into the past, and to me, this is where it gets interesting. Here we go.
The past really matters. And I've just seen in recent years a remorseless war on everything in the Western past, and particularly on the American past. A war on, I mean, to the extent that you can't even agree anymore when America was founded. The New York Times used to be the paper of record, has deliberately tried to shift the founding date of America. That sort of stuff matters.
You're talking about the 1619 project.
If you don't agree when your nation was founded, that's quite a big difference. If you don't agree whether the founding fathers were any good or not, whether they were just slave owners or they were something else maybe, that's not good. When you can't agree that Abraham Lincoln was a hero, that's not good. If you can't agree on any of the past, you know, I live in New York, and last November...
Okay, so hidden behind this statement of the past, see, he's not talking about true history. Now, he's going to go a lot deeper with this, but he's not talking about truth. So he mentions the founding fathers, and notice how he dismissed, well, were they slave owners? Is that really a big deal? Well, he is saying this now, of course, in favor of us Caucasians weren't that bad. After all, we did bring modernization. We did bring civil behavior to the world. Now that's what they're saying here, right? Which is not true. They're going to even say that, you know, we brought democracy, which is, again, not true. Rome had it. There are other nations that had it. But I digress. I'm going to say, we'll get to the America part later, because, yeah, America does stand alone in terms of democracy, but not without its fault. The problem here is, of course, he is coming as a white Caucasian defending the evilness of white carnage, downplaying it, right? Saying, oh, it's no big deal. Let's let him describe himself.
The New York Council Chamber, the City Council Chamber, voted to remove the statue of Thomas Jefferson. This happens all the time, but when a mob doesn't get to a statue, the authorities will take it down preemptively. And the Council Chamber in New York pulled down, crated up, and took out the back door the statue of Thomas Jefferson that had been there since the 1830s. And you know, one of the members of the council said, well, that's because Thomas Jefferson doesn't represent our values. Now, if Thomas Jefferson doesn't represent your values, who does?
Okay, let's answer that question. What were the values of Thomas Jefferson? See, remember, he's going to just kind of downplay, oh, this slave thing, but we're not going to downplay it. Here is a man who owned slaves, whipped slaves, slept with slaves, fathered children by slaves. It gets worse. He thought black people stink. He thought black people were inferior. What values are you referring to now? See, the problem with his perspective is diminishing the evilness of how these white Caucasians think. I get this all the time. He mentions the 1619 project and said, well, they are trying to change the history date. And the 1619 project did not do that. There are a couple of things in terms of method I did disagree with that. But basically the 1619 project basically did this. It said, instead of starting with 1776, let's start with 1619 when slaves, when slaves were brought here on the shores. How did that event frame America? That's basically what the 1619 project did. 157 years later, in 1776, you had over 10 generations of slaves born on this soil, so that in 1776, when the Declaration of America was here, those Caucasians who were born on this soil were engrafted as natural citizens. So much so that when again, in the 18th century, they were arrogant against immigration. They didn't want immigrations came in because natural born Americans looked down on the Irish, the Polish, the Italians, and all these immigrants coming in there. But let's back up for a moment. These same natural born white Caucasians, blacks shared the same inalienable rights, did they not? They were born here on this soil. Furthermore, when Thomas Jefferson writes that we hold these truths self-evident that all men are created by the Creator and endowed with inalienable rights. I know I messed that up, but notice he said that all men were created and endowed with inalienable rights by the Creator. But of course, when he wrote that, he did not mean naturally born black slaves. So what values are you talking about? We further have to kind of ask this question. How is it, and he's going to get into this later, but I'll deal with it now so you can kind of know I'm prepping you for this now. How he's going to bring up the idea that America was great for immigrants. No, I think I'm going to deal with that. I'm going to push that off to later. Let me deal with the idea of the founding of America, the evilness of the founding. Because remember, when he talks about how good the Caucasian European colonizers were, how did they treat the Native Americans? And how did they treat now get this, how did they treat those who were naturally born on this soil? So when you talk about a free society, they weren't that good. They were brutal. They were evil. But how does America, who claims to be the land of the free, who claims to be a nation that was started by God, he did, remember he mentioned biblical values. How does America then say we're not going to afford or give those same values to its black American citizens who were naturally born here? See, that's the history that I want to talk about. That's what he's trying to downplay. Furthermore, let's go a little deeper. How did you convince then naturally born black slaves that they did not have rights as Caucasians? How did you do that? Well, you did it by conditioning. You did it by religion, Christianity. You did it by culture. You did it by laws. You did it by science, right? False science. You lied on the science. You said black people were inferior to white people in every way. Okay? So those were the lies. that condition. You treated black people a certain way. But wait a minute, white people were conditioned the same way. And guess what? Mary is a product of that thought. Why do you think he thinks this? Why do you think he's talking this way? We go all the way back to how Caucasians conditioned themselves that they were superior to black people. Now, he's talking about the West, which meaning not only America, but he's talking about Caucasian Europeans. And yes, that's where the seeds of the modern day racism began, and it spread through colonization throughout the whole world. And that's why when he said there's a war on the West, why? Because people are saying you all were evil for doing this. You all were wrong for doing this. That's what his so-called war on the West means. Okay? So when he says Thomas Jefferson values, well, what values? The only people who benefited from Thomas Jefferson's value were white people. It wasn't Native Americans, and it surely wasn't black Americans. And he's saying now, for them to say we're going to take this statue down, well, here's my point on the statues, whether it's Confederate statues, whatever. I don't believe they belong in the public arena. Put them in museums. But if you're going to put them in the public arena, I wouldn't I wouldn't die on that hill. But if you're going to do that, then put the truth out for them. Tell them what the real truth were, not like what Mary is doing. All right, let's continue.
Who does?
Well, you know what
Who
they're
are you
talking
going to nominate? Yourself,
okay.
maybe?
Okay. You know what, and again, so really what you're saying is the war on the West is from people who only see the bad in
Yes.
what the West has done. And of course the West did things like colonialism.
Sure.
And had slavery.
Absolutely.
I think what they're missing is that those are human things. Everyone did those bad things.
Right.
The things that the West did good.
Everybody did it kind of thing there is so far silly, right? How many times have your mother even told you that? Well, if everybody in classrooms were acting up, does that justify you acting up? Does it justify you not obeying the teacher? How silly is that? But I'll go a step further, because he is correct, right? That slavery was a part of human history, right? However, America, now let's stop with this. Let's go back to Mary's West, right? His West, which is European Caucasians. They were the ones that started, they planted the seeds of racism, meaning this. They planted the seeds of saying that black people, they targeted one race. Black people were inferior. Now they butchered and did wrong to everywhere they colonized. But they targeted black people and said they were inferior. America amplified it, right? And said that blacks were inferior and slaves. But America is the only nation that claimed biblical values, democracy, freedom for all, inalienable rights to all God's creation. The evil Thomas Jefferson wrote that we hold these truths as self-evident that all men are created by their creator and endowed by inalienable rights. Again, sorry for butchering that again. I'll say it's a paraphrase. But America is the only nation that said we are free, right? No other nation had this creed. No other nation had these laws. So you can't compare America with other nations. America is supposed to be far better. Let's continue.
I'm not going to say they're unique to the West, but there's some pretty good things that all the people who hate the West wouldn't
Yes.
really want to live without, like rule of law and air conditioning.
There were again. So here's the problem, and this is shame on Bill, right? Air conditioning, things like that. They were in other nations in very primitive forms, right? So Caucasians were not the only ones who brought these inventions. Um, Egypt, go back to Egypt, go back to Syria, go back to Babylon, and you see a lot of these kind of, we will call them prehistoric or primitive, better word, I'm sorry, primitive kind of inventions like air conditioning, irrigation systems. We can go on and on and on. Okay, let's continue.
Also, what a weird thing it would be to go to Africa, to countries where people sold slaves to the Arabs, to the Europeans and others. What a weird thing it would be to go to, say, any country like Nigeria and say, you know, everyone in Nigeria, you're all guilty because of this now. And they said, well, it wasn't my time. You go, no, but you're guilty now.
Well,
He is referring to CRT, critical race theory, or the false narrative that they paint of critical race theory. First of all, critical race theory doesn't teach that. Civil rights activists doesn't teach that. You do have, like in any case, sometimes elementary teachers, some people saying things and doing things of their own. However, that is not what the civil rights movement is about. Okay, and he knows that, and he's painting the wrong picture. All right. But I will say this, you cannot say that when immigrants came over here and benefited from Jim Crow, benefited from slavery, I'll get more on that in a moment.
People do that with the West. It's a very strange thing. It's unique to the West. We should be self-critical, but we shouldn't become self-destructive. We need to have...
So how are we self-destructive because we tell the truth? How are we self-destructive when we're continual fighting the fight? White supremacy has surged over 800% since the election of Barack Obama. So what is the self-destructive here? It's not on those who are fighting against white supremacy. The first African slaves landed on these shores in 1619. 240 years later, we fought the bloodiest war to end it. You had to fight a war to end it. There's no good about that. The good was, yes, we ended it, but notice we fought a war. And then 20 years later, Jim Crow came along and went all the way to 1965. Legal racism, legal segregation in this nation. That again, from 1955 to 1965, we had to fight a bloody war to end these evil practices. Over 80% of this nation's history has been fighting institutional racism. So who are you see, the problem here, he's not talking about those white people. When you see pictures of Ruby Ridge, when you see pictures of Emmett Till, when you see the crowds of people who fought hard to keep segregation, those white mothers who are grandmothers now, he's not talking about them. He is saying that the fact that we talk about these things, the fact that we talk about taking down traitors, Confederate traitors, symbols of Confederate traitors, that's what he's talking about. We should keep them up. We should. So the self-destruction that he's talking about, again, this is a white conservative, a white European that's defending the evil of Caucasians who perpetrated these sins. Okay, let's continue.
Things we revere from the past. We need to have things that we treasure. We need to have common heroes.
And if I can just go back to what you're saying about Africa, I think to clarify, you're saying that the people who captured the slaves in the interior of Africa were other Africans.
Oh, for sure, of course.
Right. Okay. And then they brought them to the coast. And so
because there was
again,
a trade all around the world.
So, but again, it's a human thing to be a schmuck. That's
And shame on you, Bill, for downplaying this, because here's the difference. Again, slavery was a human thing. But hey, wait a minute. When people claim to be morally superior, Christian, and American as you now enjoy, Doesn't that make their hypocrisy more evil, that they bought the slaves and brought them here to the land of the free? Let's continue.
It is. It's just humans are not good people.
No.
I've said it many times.
I've seen evidence.
I've seen it too. And like the word slave comes from Slav, which are white people.
And in Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries still, they use the word abid plural, for black people there. It means slave. They use the term now. There are 40 million slaves in the world today. That's more than there were in the 19th century. If people in America could get off this thing of endlessly beating up on their own past and look at the world today, you could do something about actual problems.
Now, disgusting that he downplay again the impact of slavery, the impact of Jim Crow, and said actual problems. Slavery was an actual problem that impacted people, hurt people. We are still getting over the effects of slavery today. We don't have time to even cover that, but the impact of that, okay? And so, yeah, okay, it's nice if you are Caucasian, yeah. But even in that, there are a lot of Caucasians who still think the same way. As I said, white supremacy has surged 80%. We have every day what's known as the Karens, okay? Where do you think this racism comes from? On college campuses, on grade schools. There was a video of a young boy who was, I think, 11, who went to a black neighbor with a whip and he was beating on the door. We can go on and on and on and on and on. Where do you think that comes from? We are still dealing with the effects of racism that was conditioned by America. Let's continue.
Where do you stand on
Yeah,
all
I mean,
this?
I think you're also saying something else, which is that we're responsible for our own behaviors. We're not responsible for the behaviors of white people 200 years ago. It's individual responsibility. So.
All right, I'm cutting in on him because he brings absolutely nothing of value to this conversation. So, all right.
Amber Heard is responsible for her behaviors. Johnny Depp is responsible for his behaviors.
Wow.
You know, I mean, I think
it's quite a segue, Mike.
Well, you kind of. I was thinking about beforehand because the producer said I needed to have something to say about this. I thought, you know, equal justice under the law is a better principle than believe all women. We actually have a system set up to evaluate the claims made, and we don't discriminate or make judgments based on your group identity. We hold individual responsibility above all else.
By the way,
Can I just say about it? Because one of the things I say in The War on the West is that we know that there must be something good about us now. Why do we know that? Because migrants around the world want to come to the West. The top country in the world that migrants want to come to is the United States of America by a very long way. And the next countries are Britain, Canada, and a couple of other Western countries. So the footfall tells us something. When the boats cross the Mediterranean from North Africa to the south of Europe, they don't meet boats going the other way.
Now, what he doesn't talk about is the slave ships that imported slaves. They were chained to the bow. I digress, but hey.
Migrants cross the southern border. They don't meet Texans fleeing to Guatemala or Venezuela. So the point is that the footfall tells us something. The footfall tells us something. And my suggestion is, if we've done something right that means the world wants to come here now, it must mean we did something right in the past. This country was designed well.
well, I mean,
Okay, I'll stop it there because that's ludicrous, right? One, let's unpack what he said. So this idea that, well, hey, you know, we must be good because everyone wants to come here. Well, remember, everyone didn't have a choice to come here, and then when they were released, look how they were treated. Look how when you talk about immigration, think about this. The very people like Mary are opposing those who are coming here, like from the southern border. You oppose them, right? So not everybody is welcome to come here, but as you claim. And then, of course, you have to understand, even back, the immigration laws were really designed against people like the Irish and the Italians and the Polish, because the natural-born citizens of America didn't want them here. Again, just a distortion of the truth as to ease their guilt or to hide their guilt. Yes, America is good because the very, I don't know if the founding fathers, such as Jefferson, had they known what would have happened just 80 years from then, what they wrote in the Constitution, just free the slaves. So the Constitution, yes, we were able to correct because of the Constitution. But let's not hide the truth. Let's not distort the truth that America was an evil place. It was a racist place that committed atrocities against its own citizens. Okay? Its own citizens. And when you talk about people fleeing, there are nations that people can't go to, like Switzerland. Switzerland is a very nice nation, but there are a lot of countries that you cannot go to because they don't open their shores to immigration. And even people, as I said before, like Mary, his side of the argument was certainly they are fighting fiercely. Remember, Trump won the election based upon one of his fake campaign promises of building a wall to keep out immigrants. That is my perspective. Love to hear your thoughts and your opinions. Add them to the comments section. All comments are welcome, and don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. Till next time, I'll see you then.